welcome to the TasFarmers podcast. Today it's a privilege to have our National Farmers Federation, our key advocacy body, talking at the national level and keeping it real. But I'll go around the table as always and introduce everyone. I'll start with our very own CEO, Nathan Cowman, the man with his finger on the political pulse. Nathan, how are you?
I'm very good and great to be back on the pod again.
Good. Thanks for coming along, making the time. And I think we'll start with Mike, who's Chief Executive Officer for National Farmers Federation, newly minted, came along in March, and his focus is very much on sector unity, food security for the nation and delivering practical outcomes for farmers. Acting CEO for New South Wales Farmers, CEO for AgForce, brings very extensive knowledge in agribusiness and corporate experience. A man of finance and business. Would that be a great way to sum you up, Mike?
Oh, look, good afternoon. It's great to be back in Tasmania. The bit you missed is I spent 3 years living in Smithton with the Van Diemen's Land Company, milking cows and contributing. So that was a great time of my life between 2011 and 14, and it's great to be back.
The fresh air of the Northwest. Didn't know that. Didn't find that on your bio, so I do apologise. And our other guest from the National Farmers Federation, I guess he takes the title of our Ian, but El Presidente we used to call Ian, Hamish McIntyre, Queensland farmer, operator, agribusiness operator, irrigated enterprises, dryland cropping for cattle, feedlotting, broiler chicken production. I have to talk a bit about that later. You've been on the National Farmers Federation board since 2003, chair of Cotton Australia, and now serving as National Farmers President. Strong advocate, practical policy guy, particularly strong recent times around fuel and fertiliser, and talking about our sovereign capability in this nation, which I think is a really important topic. Have I missed anything, Hamish?
No, Grayson, it's great to be here down in Tasmania again, and very different weather from where I was yesterday in Rockhampton, so it's good to be back in the south.
Teasing us with warm weather?
Yeah, it's no, anyway, it's great to be down here and look forward to talking to you.
And you're both here for AgFest, our largest Tasmanian agricultural festival, so thanks for coming down for a couple of different reasons. Look, the EU trade deal has been done. We've been talking here on this podcast about the rising costs for farmers, particularly around fuel and fertiliser, which will be no shock to you guys, and freight for us little Tasmanian guys just trying to get across that piece of Bass Strait. So there's a lot of pressure across the system. Some big decisions need to be made, particularly as we head into budget week, make sure we're heading in the right direction and trying to ease the cost of living crisis and some of the other problems during this crisis. But before we go into things like trade, let's talk fuel and fert from a national perspective. Mike, what's the feeling nationally around fertiliser and fuel?
Look, it's an incredibly dynamic and tough situation we find ourselves in. I think the latest, from what I hear in talking to producers around the nation, is we're getting a little bit more comfortable about supply. Not totally comfortable, but there's a little bit of comfort around that, and that is a credit to the federal government underwriting the shipments early, getting in the international markets, picking up spot trades earlier than other countries. So a little bit of pressure coming off supply, but it's not done. The big issue is cost. We are producing food and fibre as a skinny margin business at the best of time, and if two of your big inputs have lifted like they have from cost, then even if you can get hold of it, the economics of producing food and fibre are very tough to see right now. So family farmers faced with, in the broadacre cropping, for example, leaving land fallow and losing less money, or planting crops and losing more money, incredibly difficult position to find yourself in as a family farm, as perhaps a mum and dad with a mortgage, other commitments. What do you do with that? And not only the economics hard to see in some areas, but it's changing so quickly. When you buy on the spot market or you can't forward price those inputs and you need some of those inputs during the crop and the harvesting process, very difficult to know what to do with that. So the pressure right now is changing by the day. From my perspective, sits more around the cost and the economics of producing food than it does supply. And that's a really good conversation to have with the federal government, because we have for generations in Australia taken locally grown, healthy, well-priced food for granted as Australians. The supermarket shelves have been full 365 days a year, every year. That's at genuine risk right now. The geopolitical tensions have shown how fragile our supply chains are, how fragile our primary production industry is. We think the government's starting to get it. Some of the early moves around underwriting, for example, shipments, examples of that. But it's a real chance to have a broader conversation with Australia about that fragility, about what we need to do to make sure that we don't end up back here again. But the short-term challenges and the economics of producing food are really challenging.
Hamish, just outside of the norm, we don't get to hear too much about our brothers in cotton. What's the sense around fuel and fertiliser in the cotton sector?
Yes, very similar. In the cotton sector, we're just completing our picking as we speak. And so we are now preparing for the next crop. So we put a base load of nitrogen down through our winter is our normal production cycle, and many farmers haven't been able to access that yet. We're hoping that it'll arrive in June, July. But so most cotton farmers are grain producers too, obviously. So when you're on a larger scale, we do orders every 6 months with our supply chain, and they've been able to source the nitrogen we need for this winter crop. But at this point in time, it's not there for the summer crop. So there is genuine concern. The other thing I just add to what Mike said there is the other effect we're seeing of the fuel situation right across Australia is how it's affecting our regional communities. I mean, the tourists aren't out there, and a lot of our small towns all over Australia do heavily rely on that flow of tourism, particularly through winter when it gets cold down here and in southern Australia. We see a lot of southerners come up into Queensland and right through the deserts and out there, and our townships do really retire on that. It's a big part of their business cycle annually, and that's just not happening. And we need to get the message out that everything is okay, right across Australia from a fuel perspective. There's fuel there. Yes, it is a little more expensive, but we still need the people to travel, because again, that just breaks down our whole regional community if a lot of those businesses are put under threat too by this situation, due to no fault of their own at all. It's just it's been bad policy over 20, 25 years that we've pushed manufacturing, and refinery in Australia offshore, and here we are in this situation, and it's amazing how inflationary it is too. I mean, interest rates are going up, and we're seeing this whole problem multiplied. So it's just we farmers are one thing, and our role of reducing export income for Australia, but it's also damaging small businesses right throughout regional Australia.
What's your push with the federal government if supply does sort of further tighten? What are you asking for?
Well, we've been involved with the government looking at the worst case scenario and through different tiers, and obviously essential services are number one, and we all support that. Without any argument, it's very important that we believe agriculture is front and centre, food production and the supply chain, or our transport industry that moves all the commodities we produce on the farms around Australia to our metropolitan areas and ports as interlinked as we are. So, farming and transport, food production need to be treated as one. So we've been advocating that very strongly, and the government has been, has worked well with us in those areas and agree. So it's just, say in a farming situation, if it got to a situation where we only, had 10, 15% of what our requirements were in my business, I'd have to make a decision around, that goes around intensive animal industries, obviously first, with number one is pumping water for livestock, isn't it? Number two, would be making sure our intensive animal business, our feedlotting for cattle and sheep and our broiler chickens, obviously they need it next, because there's a huge animal welfare issue there if we run out of fuel. And then where we're producing grain crops and particularly fibre crops, in our situation, that'd be right down the bottom end. So we've sort of worked with government to make sure that we can look at these situations to do this planning in reverse, a rear vision mirror look, and that's by how and when we do across Australia with postcodes apply for our diesel fuel rebates. So it is all possible, but it's so our big push to government though is to which they are working on, and we hope in this budget we do see it, is obviously increase storage right across Australia, so we have more fuel readily available for ourselves as farmers, but also our regional communities and our transport industries. And we don't want to just see it on the coastlines. We need to see it in regional Australia, up our way over the Great Divide Range, out, whether it's in central Victoria, places like Dubbo in New South Wales, Emerald in Queensland. We need to get it off the coast and make sure that it's affordable and it's there always. As we've been discussing, we should be navigating this situation very smoothly in Australia. It's ridiculous that we're all under such inflationary pressure when we have abundance of natural resources. And it's also around regulation, allowing companies in Australia that are in the industry to start exploration again. Looking for oil.
Is this a red tape thing?
It's a red and green tape.
Yeah.
I mean, we're dealing with all sorts of basin issues, and it's just ridiculous what companies have to go through to explore for further natural resources that we all require everyday life. If
you had to speak plainly, do you think Australia has a plan to prioritise agriculture with a potential shortage on the horizon? Is the government absolutely serious here? Serious enough?
My view, in working very closely with government the last few weeks, is they are finally understanding the need for it. So, the old saying, "I've never let a good crisis go to waste," is very relevant here for our industry. I think they do get it. This government, the last number of weeks, has been working multiple times per week with us in industry across a large number of forums, and they're not resiling from conversations which we haven't been able to have before about the sovereign needs and protections for Australia to ensure that we don't go short of food, to ensure that we learn these lessons well. And that includes, local capability in fuel, in fertiliser, manufacturing, regional communities, recognising, and we've joined with the Business Council of Australia and a number of others in asking for a 25% reduction in red tape, for example, a genuine root and branch review of red tape, so where it's unnecessary we can actually deal with it. And I have never seen Canberra that interested in that conversation. So, the hope and the need is that as we get through this, that sense of urgency doesn't recede. The lessons we are learning right now are taken very seriously right through the next federal election on both sides of politics. And as, the economics hopefully returns to farming, if it doesn't, we have an even worse situation, that we don't forget about the incredibly tough time that we're in right now and what we need to do to make sure we don't get there, to ensure Australia continues to have that food security we've taken for granted for generations. For those lucky enough to travel around the world, there are very few supermarkets that are as good as ours, where the food's as good, it's as fresh, it's as locally grown, it's the quality, it's reasonably good price-wise in terms of a percentage of a family's budget. All of those things we've taken for granted, Australia has, a lot of the world doesn't. And it's in a very, very risky position at the moment where we could well lose it. So I'm an optimist, but I believe the government has actually heard the message, because how close we are right now to losing that. And our job and the job of industry and regional communities is to make absolutely sure they don't forget that as they get on to the next issue. And as hopefully this immediate problem fades behind us, let's use this opportunity to think about what we need to do to make sure next time good old Australia at the bottom of the world, at the end of the supply chain, can do what it can do, and it doesn't lose that sovereign capability. Storage
of fuel. In terms of fertiliser, access and price is the big thing. A farmer's just pushing on and it's just a price question, or you've alluded to it really. It sounds like the concern will be around access. Is that the main thing you hear nationally, that really they're concerned about access, or they're just going to keep doing what they're doing on the budgets they have?
Well, it's price front and centre. I mean, as Mike alluded to earlier, it's our cost of production per hectare or per megalitre as we look at irrigated crops too. So if we aren't going to receive more for these commodities we're producing and we do our gross margins, I mean, there are generally some farmers that have chosen to sell their fertiliser they've had stored on farm and take that profit, take $1,400 or $1,500 a tonne instead of taking the weather risks that we all do as farmers. We understand that's what we do, what we love, but we always deal with what's in front of us. But some have decided to, due to their own financial situation too, it's not worth the risk, this situation. So I believe that it's not just that fertiliser is one thing, but it's fuel too. And there's other crazy things going on where we're not using our own ethanol. It's still being exported, would you believe, at the moment.
You're pushing for biofuels, is that right?
We are, absolutely.
What's the story there? What's the
industries like the sugar industry in Australia and even our canola industry? I mean, a lot of our canola, our biggest export to the EU is canola, and a lot of it's been turned into aviation, fuel in Europe. So, I mean, again, it needs to be considered at home, and it opens up another market for farmers in Australia to have a biofuels industry going, but it also ensures we aren't as vulnerable as we've found we are. And it's good business for farmers. It's good security for the nation as a whole. It's another option. There's always debate about, ethanol and engines or whatever, but at 3% as what we're calling for, which would use the ethanol that's been produced in Australia at this point in time, have it blended, and biodiesel, we should be using it. I mean, it's just, again, it's incredible that those businesses aren't able to get it into the supply chain in Australia. We have our Prime Minister running around cap in hand to Asia trying to shore up supply for us when there is supply here that we should be using. It just, again, makes no sense of the way we aren't manufacturing urea, particularly here with all our natural gas and energy and water in Australia. I mean, we should be supplying Asia with affordable urea particularly. We've got an abundance of what we need here. It's, again, regulations we're talking about, cost of production based around red tape, green tape, that we've just got to move away so the industries that are specialists in this areas can get on and produce these commodities affordable. And it's a regional security issue too. We have other big countries, as we know, ingratiate themselves in our area. We have a responsibility to supply affordable food and fibre to our near neighbours, and so we've really got to work collectively on all these things and make sure we do our bit to ensure they are stable economies around us. We need their labour. We all use palm oil into schemes on our farms. It's huge, so it's all working hand in hand together.
We're reopening that question of our own capability, particularly around food and fertiliser. But Mike, have we learnt the lessons of COVID-19 when we are at the end of the supply chain?
No, we haven't. It's clearly evident. Here we are again with a geopolitical issue, no better off than we were under COVID. In fact, arguably worse off. Interestingly, the conversation with the government and giving them the real issues about how fragile we are, as I said earlier, I think starting to get through. But, we used to be on the list of countries that was completely self-sufficient for food. We're not now. There are some elements of food that we need to import because we are no longer self-sufficient. And that's an incredible story given where we were as a country only 10, 20 years ago. The countries like Guerin are the only ones left that do it all across 7 food groups. Australia used to be on the list. We are no longer. We import some food products. I know dairy is a big industry in Tasmania. Australia is no longer self-sufficient in dairy. What a tragedy given, the landscape, the environment and the natural ability to grow dairy, grass-fed dairy in Australia, yet we're not self-sufficient, and that's just one example. So, incredible vulnerability, worse vulnerability than we had at COVID. And as I said, unlike at COVID, we need to learn the lessons or we'll end up back here in worse form again. And we're not that far from losing that food security, which would be a pretty scary situation for a country, well, for any country, but for Australia as an island nation not to have enough food to feed its population, to have supermarket shelves empty, to have, the old toilet paper runs across staple food items is more scary than it sounds. In fact, it's horrifying to think.
It is. It's horrifying. Yep. End of day stuff sometimes. Nathan, you've been in the production game. And sort of industry-wise, what's your take on it, on our ability to produce our own food, fibre, and other things?
I think it's definitely worrying, and I think it is a deliberate, intention of the supermarket chains to, wherever possible, source the cheapest product that they can, not thinking about the long-term bigger picture. If we do have geopolitical or pandemic type scenarios, we know that there's a lot of, fresh produce sourcing that, still all happens from the local market. But, when you flip over a can or a packet on the shelf, it's quite alarming that products or brands that, may have been traditionally Australian or, may have been sourced from Australia only a month or a year or two ago, now might be completely sourced from an international country. So, I think it's something we need to think about when the federal government is working through that food security strategy, because now more than ever is a reminder of why it's important to, have that capability locally that we've had for years.
Well, we've done a lot of things well in Australia, including making cars, and so there's no reason why we shouldn't do this stuff. And some of this stuff actually feeds into our ability to perhaps make tanks and sell them around the world. But if we can't do that and we don't have the infrastructure here, it's a bit of a problem. And so we have trading partners that sometimes impact what we do here and could see the demise of some industries, perhaps like cars. It leads us into a bit of a segue around the EU deal. And I know the NFF have been very, very strong in the background in over a number of years working on the deal. The response from the recently signed deal, though, it feels a bit mixed and raises questions about the timing, both why sign it now and also what does it mean into the future. But Mike, can you give us a bit of an overall summary of the EU deal broadly and what it is, what it means?
I can. The EU is a very big market, a very prospective market. If the rules are set fairly and reasonably, in a market that we've had a tremendous relationship with over many years, but the EU is has been very difficult to deal with in terms of a free trade deal which fairly recognises agriculture, recognises not only our ability to grow food, but to do it in a way that builds biodiversity in the environment. The fact that we have a unique landscape, different to the EU landscape yet. They have conversations with us about EU environmental standards being applied to Australian food as an example. So, the short answer to a very good question is that over a number of years, agriculture has asked that the Australian government in these negotiations ensure that it's a good deal, or would rather walk away and have no deal, because a bad deal, is incredibly unhelpful for agriculture. We applauded the Australian government when they walked away in 2023 from the negotiations in Japan, and what we have essentially is the same deal now signed. So incredibly unhelpful for agriculture, may be good for the country more broadly, but we asked all the way through that agriculture be carved out if it's a bad deal for us. As I said, we prefer no deal than a bad deal, but we have what we believe is a bad deal for agriculture and very limited ability to redress that going forward. The government talks about a 5-year review. There's no leverage left. We've signed the deal. The leverage is gone. Why would the EU side want to reopen something that they don't have to in 5 years' time? So in a very difficult position. And perhaps the other thing I'd say, which is a little bit away from the EU deal itself, is it's another reminder to industry in Australia that we need to diversify our markets. We have quality products respected around the world. We do sometimes fall into the trap of getting too used to one market. Some of the big markets like China, we learnt lessons from in the last few years around, for example, seafood out of South Australia. Some of the red meat issues that we bumped into with the China side reminded us of the need for diversification. On the back of that fright, we diversified markets in Asia further. Perhaps the EU one is another reminder to us of that no one market should have control over us. It's a big world and we have a quality product. But to your question, the EU deal is largely as was contemplated and declined in 2023, but tragically, for whatever reason, it was signed this time.
Bad deal.
Bad deal.
Wrong time.
Wrong time. All of the above. Many examples, and I don't know whether we've got the time for it today, but many examples of complete inequity where...
No, give us some of those examples, please.
Pork and dairy are two examples that come immediately to mind. Sugarcane's another one, which I know is not grown in Tasmania. But in the sugar game, a tonnage which is not commercial, they would have known that. So we have access to the markets, just not on a commercial scale. So in other words, we have no access, yet the deal itself says there's access, there's not. So an incredibly bad outcome for sugar. For pork, essentially producers in the EU with about 33% subsidy have unlimited access to Australia, but we have very limited access to them with no government support. Dairy is reasonably similar to that. So, the access this way is broader and they come from a subsidised base. The access their way is very limited with no subsidies, dairy and pork being examples of that. So those three examples. There are many. Tragically, it's just not a good deal.
Well, you guys know margins are tough. If you're in bringing potatoes or carrots from Europe and they're subsidised by 33%, what does that do to the industry? I mean, it's a pretty simple answer, isn't it?
It's a very, very simple answer. That in Australia at the moment, this is a broad statement and it changes per commodity, but, net margins sit at around 3%. And if you think of the cost of land, which in some parts of Australia has tripled in the last few years. If you want young people to enter agriculture that don't come from a family farming background, they would be better putting the money in the bank with zero risk and a higher return than they would put in agriculture with a lot of risk and low returns. That's the brutal reality of the economics of agriculture. So then you introduce subsidised product into the domestic market and wonder why industry says this is a really tough position to be in and we'd rather no deal than a bad deal, because at the end of the day you put at risk the fabric of regional Australia and the fabric of an industry we've taken for granted for generations.
Is it a case of destroying an industry a bit like cars? Are we at risk? Is nobody sounding the alarm?
Look, I don't think so. I mean, look, agriculture is still a wonderful industry overall in Australia to be involved in. I mean, I'm still very positive about it. I mean, our family are growing our business whenever we have an opportunity to, and have three sons coming along that are all doing ag science, ag business type courses, and we are seeing a lot of young people generally wanting to come back to our regional communities. But we do need to have vibrant communities to attract people, and we want in this budget, we'd love to see too, allocation of funds towards building, affordable housing in regional Australia as much as it has been around the peri-urban areas. I mean, we want, people to, consider agriculture as a career and obviously have the ability to set up in our regional areas and grow their careers out there. With technology, we can do all sorts of things these days. We know, I mean, we don't have to live actually where we work, as we all know. So families can operate effectively in all sorts of industries from regional communities with technology we have these days. And one member of the family can be working on farms or, in agriculture, and the spouse or whoever could be still doing something else elsewhere. So we want to see encouragement of, decentralisation again too from this government, not just centralisation.
But are we seeing a deal that's going to erode our own nation's food security over time if it's not renegotiated?
Around the EU?
EU.
Oh, no, look, we are advocating strongly. There's other agreements in the wind, and frustratingly, one of the things we did hear from government after this came down when we were pushing back very strongly is that they believe that it's very important to show the world that Australia's open for free trade and free trade agreements, to highlight that we aren't going the other way as some other nations are with the old style of operating protectionism. So, we're looking for fair trade too, and this is what's so frustrating about this deal. I mean, with subsidised production in Europe, and we aren't subsidised to any extent. It's just not free and fair at all. So it's drawing a very long bow for us to say we're flying a flag to
highlight that Australia is still open for free trade agreements. Look, and we do, as an industry, as an NFF, we do support free trade, but this one really was not what we were working on, and it is a generational problem. I mean, it's going to be very hard to turn this around, and it's a very big market and a very strong market, with 470 million people living in Europe that can afford a lot of the high value, sustainably and ethically produced products that we do produce. I mean, it should be a niche market for us. Instead, we've got this very ordinary situation, as Mike alluded to. Some of our industries now have no protection at all from a tariff or a particularly quantity of potential that can be imported. I mean, volumes could be open-ended. So in that pork and dairy space particularly. So there's specific industries that we are very concerned about, but that's more to the point, I think. And talking food security, we always hear about, that pushback is when we're dealing with many members of government that probably don't understand what the actual situation is. Or we export 70% of what we produce in Australia, but you've got to remember that 70% of it, a lot of it is big bulk commodities like grains. It's not the perishables, the greens,
small goods.
Yeah, small goods, the perishable we enjoy on our tables every day. And particularly the dairy products, those sort of anything that's short shelf life is where we're under threat, and that is what we're referring to. I mean, those industries are being put under extreme pressure, where we will continue to grow, grain efficiently with technology and our scale and size of farms and machinery, and that's. And things like cotton too. I mean, it's not fair to throw back at us that you export 70%, because a lot of it is big bulk stuff that isn't relevant to what we need day to day to sustain ourselves.
You've spoken about fair and free trade, Nathan. What was your and you've written a number of editorials, well-written editorials, may I say. What was your sort of thoughts on the EU at the end of the day after the wash-up?
Well, I think some of the things Hamish was saying there probably echoes what we were saying. We had a new, free trade agreement. However, it wasn't fair.
Yeah.
And when we already have producers in Tasmania that are at a disadvantage because we're an island state and we haven't got a national highway to, get what we produce to market, it just confounds that disadvantage that a lot of our producers feel day to day. Well,
the federal government's done an interesting job on that one. And talking of federal government, Mike, we're heading into the federal budget. What does agriculture actually need to see in this budget? There's a lot of things being rumoured. We're talking capital tax. There's a couple of issues. What do you think Ag actually needs to see out of this budget?
We were asking for two things at a high level and both critical, and we've touched on today. One is fair tax settings. So the government need to understand how agriculture is structured, how an expensive asset skinny margin business works, the importance of succession, of family farming, of regional communities, and of the social fabric that sits around all of that. So fair tax settings. So, we're hearing a lot, we all are hearing a lot in the paper as the government starts to release, some teasers about what might be in the budget. It looks like it's going to be a reformist budget by Labor standards, so there will be changes to tax. You touched on capital gains, that's been talked about by the federal government. Agriculture needs to be recognised for the unique elements of it if we're going to hold together an industry that we can be incredibly proud of and has an enormously powerful future. So, for young people thinking about getting into ag, it's a great industry to get into. We need the settings to be set right to allow that confidence to come into successful careers. So sensible tax settings across the elements they're talking about is critical, and not carve-outs, but recognising the relevant and the unique position of agriculture and fair and reasonable outcomes which allow that fabric to remain in place. And secondly, investment. Investment in industry is really important, because one of the lessons that we took from COVID and didn't deal with, and we're learning again, is the lack of investment means we are incredibly fragile. We're not broken, but we're incredibly fragile. So supply chains, local manufacturing, businesses in regional communities, All of those things need investment. It's long-term investment. It needs to be, government investment as well alongside private sector investment. But if we get the tax settings right and the investment right, those two large underpinnings will make an enormous difference to industry, to its confidence, and in the way we come through this current crisis.
Is there anything else we should be seeing in the budget that means or would indicate that agriculture is being taken seriously?
Yes, we need all of the things we've been talking about today to be acknowledged in the budget. So the current challenges around the economics of growing food, the needs we have around infrastructure, for example. So we were incredibly disappointed today to hear that Inland Rail has been cancelled. That was described when it was launched as a nation-building project, a chance to take 220,000 trucks off the road, a chance to reduce the costs of getting food from farm to plate or to port by around 20% with the numbers talked about many years ago. And here we are 10, 15 years later with a half-completed project, costs out of control, and now cancelling, full stop, the project itself. So we've learnt none of those lessons on the way through. We continue to have an inefficient and ineffective supply chain, and what could have made an enormous difference on the East Coast has now been cancelled.
Hamish, what's your reaction to a good freight system being canned?
Oh, look, we just cannot believe it. It's to think that some of that money's been allocated to a big city again for a loop, would you believe, an underground rail loop, as against something that's nation building, potentially linking ports, reducing our emissions. I mean, getting trucks off the road. I mean, a train pulling 130 or 40 carriages, is way more efficient, effective. We talk about we've got to drive productivity in Australia, and these are the sort of things that drive productivity and improve our viability and our ability to in times of crisis, to move not just commodities, but military, whatever, effectively and quickly around Australia. I mean, it's a national security issue to do these sort of projects, and to think that it's been put on the back burner again, due to, in a lot of situations, again, a regulatory burden, costs that other countries doing the same thing wouldn't have to face. We just get on and do it is just ridiculous. It's just so frustrating. So something that is long-term, a nation-building project that will be, drive productivity in Australia for 100 years is being put on the back burner is, again, so short-sighted and just frustrating to regional communities. I mean, to think you could be linking up the new fertiliser plants in Karratha to the East Coast effectively with this, bringing that fertiliser across by train. We're talking biorefining, fuels be coming across from WA, no matter what the weather is, etc. And we have infrastructure problems all over Australia, whether it be bridges and roads. So, I mean, if the government's pulling this one, I mean, we need to see that same capital put into our roads and bridges and highways right across Australia, Tasmania here too. I mean, we all need infrastructure, don't we, to cost effectively move all our products we produce on farms in Australia, but also ensure our transport industry can operate effectively. I mean, we have roads in Western Queensland, for instance, where I come from. I mean, I can't even sit in the truck anymore. It's that rough. The roads are under such pressure. It's not funny due to the lack of access to rail. I mean, I can't think of many other countries in the world at our scale that haven't got an
effective system,
effective and efficient rail system to add to trucks. And of course, I mean, the trucking industry in Australia is driven by diesel. And again, all these things are interlinked. We could be moving fertiliser, diesel, commodities so much more cost effectively, but taking the pressure off our roads. And it's a safety issue again from our community and people who live out there. I mean, the trucks on our roads are just absolutely, under such huge pressure and trying to operate on substandard roads.
Well, from gauging the federal budget, to a few rapid-fire questions, Mike and Hamish. Biggest risk to agriculture right now, to the nation's sector, industry?
To me, it's two things. It's understanding and confidence. We need every Australian to understand what they've got, how precious and valuable it is, and how fragile it is. And the current crisis gives us that chance But the biggest risk is we don't use that to build that understanding and that confidence both in the industry, in regional communities and in broader Australia. We need young people to be entering the industry. We need city folk to know that the supermarket's going to be full of food, and then we need them to vote and talk to their politicians to make damn sure those supermarkets do stay full.
Hamish?
Cost of production as a farmer, we are really under pressure, and access to affordable and skilled labour is huge too. It's to produce these commodities. I mean, we need to have that supply chain, that linkage to what we need to do. But from an immigration policy point of view, I mean, we need the appropriate skills, and it doesn't. Semi-skilled people that can drive our trucks, can operate our cotton pickers, our large tractors. That's what we need as much as anything. So it's access to quality, suitable labour, and cost of production, I believe, is where we are under the greatest threat. And obviously we do generally need, that can be offset by receiving more for the commodities we do produce in Australia, but understand that's inflationary. So if we're not, we will go backwards and we'll lose a lot of great farmers in Australia. So it's got to find that balance. So it's driving down the cost of production, I believe. So food does remain affordable is the key.
Well, if you had a magic feather duster that you could clean house with, what policy might you immediately change or decision in Australia that would have the biggest impact in your minds?
I would throw out the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which is a federal act, and it overlays state-based environmental legislation and local planning laws. It is an incredible impost on agriculture. It's an incredible impost on biodiversity and the environment. Nobody's winning. It's building costs and uncertainty at a rapid rate. What I'd immediately do if I had the feather duster is throw it out the door and start again.
Hamish, what would you do if you had a magic feather duster?
Yeah, look, I support Mike there totally. That act is really causing problem for us in Queensland around controlling our regrowth and where we farm, where our properties are on the side of the barrier reef. So it's a shocker. And I think that we all have our state laws in place around vegetation and water. It's so frustrating that there's this overlying blanket being put across to say that our states aren't managing our native flora and fauna well enough. I think it's just a reach too far. The other big one that I believe that's so important to Australia is just, and you're probably not affected so much down here, but is this continuation in the Murray-Darling Basin, which produces a third of our food and fibre in Australia, employs 75 to 80,000 people a year. This policy of continually buying water back or claiming water back by stealth, by rule changes in states that just actually pull water back. It's taking productive water out of the system, and we've been talking dairy here. It's meaning that our dairy farmers can't afford to buy water, cost effectively, cheaply enough to irrigate pastures. They have to compete in the space of, perennial tree crops, etc., that can always pay more than they can. So again, it's very bad policy that's ruining an industry based around what we believe there is, sufficient water being purchased already. And when we're looking for environmental improvements, it takes time. So we need time to see the effect of the water that's already been purchased back, what it's doing to the environment. And at this point in time, we should be focusing on, works and measures that interlink and connect that water that's already been purchased back to make it more effective and get the taxpayer in Australia getting value for money out of it. I mean, we can't afford this sort of policy. It's like raising interest rates. It's a very, very rough lever just to pull to buy more water. It's destroying our regional communities, and it's the same as losing prime ag land. The loss of prime ag land to renewable projects and corridors that aren't in the right place again is a very, very contentious issue with many of our members. So, following on from Mike's there, I believe it's about water being taken out of the productive system, but also losing prime ag land across Australia when there are other areas that are more suitable to put our renewable corridors in, and also our renewable energy. I mean, renewables are nothing new for Australian farmers. We've all been using and pumping water forever in our Southern Cross mills, haven't we? It frustrates me when we get it's as though they've come up with something new. It's just, we've always worked with Nation, we'll continue to, but it's this regulatory nonsense and an overreach too far around water and environmental policy that it's driving up our cost production and taking good land away and making it, again, driving up, making it hard for younger people to enter agriculture.
Well, on a positive, what's giving you confidence about the industry?
Oh, for me, community sentiment is changing. The conversations I have with young people, both from regional communities and big cities, is changing. It has done in the last short term. COVID was part of it. The current crisis is part of it. And because community sentiment is changing, the politicians are starting to change. They are listening to us more. The NFF has had a very good hearing in the first few weeks of the fuel and fert crisis. That, to me, is unprecedented. So gives me confidence, and we need to lean into it.
That's good to hear. Hamish, what's filling you with a bit of hope?
Oh, look, still there's nothing more that I love more than doing is producing, food and fibre. It's a noble business to be in, and it's such an important one. It is great to see younger generations wanting to come back, and we are seeing that. We just have to make sure that the opportunities we've had, we do, ensure they are there for our next generation to take over the job of producing food and fibre cost effectively. And look, it's still no better place in the world to, raise a family is on a family farm, and all the things that we take for granted, whether it's your pets and whatever, it's just such a wonderful environment. And we need to have healthy communities that have the appropriate population to support, medical facilities, everything we need, schools, etc., to encourage, young families to come back. So I think it's still a great profession to be in. I just, any young people listening to this podcast, please consider agriculture, because it still is, despite these headwinds that we're all working on your behalf, it's still a wonderful profession to be involved in. And there's nothing more satisfying than producing a crop from a seed to a harvest and a breeding cycle with an animal, and then tasting it. It really is a great profession to be in.
Good answer. I like to go around the table at the end as we close and really get to the nitty gritty about what's keeping you up, or is that thing in your nightmares. Nathan, what's happening in Tasmania that might be keeping you up at night?
I think something I've been talking to people a lot about over the last month with the supply chain disruptions going on is just reminding people that we're all reliant on the next person in the supply chain and the person before us, and we need to, be cognizant of that, work together, not take advantage of the person before you or the person after you in the supply chain, because, we have been hearing little stories lately, I suppose, around maybe people not paying bills on time, or the processor that a farmer might be providing to not being willing to take on more of the costs. And I think, to make sure we get through this crisis and all come out ready to achieve again, we just have to back each other and actually work together and talk about genuine stresses and how we get through this together.
Mike, CEO, peak advocacy body in Australia for ag. Anything that ticks over in the middle of the night for you?
Yeah, firstly, not making the most of the minute. We've talked about today. We've got a crisis in front of us. We've got a chance to reset the conversations. We haven't done that in the past. It's critical we do it this time, because the upside and the industry has a tremendously positive future. But if we don't take the lessons of the moment, we'll regret it for a long time. And, I'd also add, since I got the microphone, just this land use conflict. We need to work very hard on that coming out of this, balancing environment, social and economic elements to consideration. Producers in Australia contribute so much to the environment.
Hamish, national leader, what keeps someone like you awake at night?
Just the frustration with short-sighted policy from both state and federal governments that just inhibits the ability for us to sustain ourselves. And then I'm talking about just, enabling manufacturing in Australia again, but enabling us to get on and produce food and fibre. I mean, I don't know any farmer, I've never met one that doesn't want their farm to be left in a better state than it is when he took over from his father. Mm-hmm. And we're all the same. And to have governments overriding us, making it more expensive, and EPBC type acts that just are reached too far is very, very frustrating. So, look, I just would like to see, this situation we're in at the moment. As we started this conversation, we should have navigated this very smoothly with the abundance of natural resources we do have in Australia. And I think it's just time that across politics, the political wedging that goes on be put aside, and let's get these fundamentals right again, so that when this does occur again, and it will, we've seen COVID, now we've seen a conflict in the Middle East, cause real problems with our supply chain in Australia. We need to be self-sufficient. So let's hope we all work together, and we need the media, and we need everyone continually highlighting, no matter where you live in Australia, to our politicians the importance of this, and will help keep your interest rates down too. We're all connected.
Food cheap on the supermarket shelf and interest rates down, the great Australian dream at this stage. Thank you to the NFF. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Hamish. It's been a pleasure to have you. You'll be at our AgFest site tomorrow on Thursday. So listeners out there, members, get along, say g'day, and tell us what's keeping you up at night. Nathan, pleasure as always. Thanks for your time.
Pleasure.
And thank you to our members, of course. Without you, it doesn't happen. And our sponsors, Telstra, anyone else I should mention there, TasBuilt, all fantastic partners. And until next time, thank you again and talk soon.